So, I don't know if you heard the news, but there is not going to be a 27-inch iMac. Not only did Apple basically spell it outright during the October keynote when they literally, seriously called the 24-inch iMac an enormous amount of screen real estate.
It's the perfect size and resolution to replace both the 4K and the 5K Intel-based models.
But in a very rare confirmation of internal strategy, they issued a statement to The Verge clarifying that they have no plans for a 27-inch iMac, and that they're instead going to focus the iMac line around the existing 24-inch model. And, well, hot take here, but I think that's a good thing. With that said, it's not to suggest that I think Apple's current strategy is sufficient either. Hear me out. The iMac has a storied history. I mean, the PowerPC G3 Sporting First Edition, released in 1998, was of pinnacle importance to Apple. Not just in terms of sales or performance, but vision. It's difficult to overstate what a departure this machine was from the boring beige boxes emblematic of personal computers. It revitalized a failing product line. It helped catapult Apple back to profitability, and it cemented Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive as a formidable duo. But more than that, it crystallized the concept of the all-in-one, a seamless, intuitive computer that simply worked right out of the box for anyone and everyone. And from day one, the iMac itself has really never departed from those founding principles. It hasn't changed. But Apple has, particularly in its awareness of environmental sustainability, and customers have changed too, in increasingly pushing towards laptops. I mean, can you blame us? The idea that an entire setup is replaced, I mean, display, peripherals, everything, when a single component goes bad or heck even gets outdated? It's outlandishly wasteful. Apple tried to combat this because for a few years there, they supported something called Target Display Mode, which allowed you to plug in a mini DisplayPort cable and use any old iMac as a monitor for another newer computer. It was a great idea and saved Macs from the landfill. But it went by the wayside when the 5K iMac shipped in 2014, because that machine used a weirdo custom display controller, as DisplayPort standards at the time didn't yet support such a high resolution. Now, the argument can be made quite successfully that rapid improvements through the mid to late 2000s and early 2010s extended beyond compute units. Displays were getting higher resolutions and more luminous. The DC power supplies were becoming more efficient. SSDs, those came into existence and became incredibly quick. It just made sense to replace the whole shebang every 5 years. Look, here are some specs from the mid-range iMac configurations at 5-year intervals over the past 2 decades. You can see that with every passing revision, the jump in performance gets quite a bit smaller. We are very late into the product lifecycle for most of these components, and frankly, some are even entering the decline phase. I mean, the 2017 iMac literally has the exact same luminance, density, and color gamut of the newly refreshed iMac of today, and it has for almost a decade. The consolidation of the iMac line into a single, smaller model suggests that there will be less total material used, a simpler supply and logistics chain resulting from all of that, and with limited silicon and memory choices, it's obviously targeted at the buyer that the iMac has always targeted, the everyman or every woman that will keep this thing on their desk for a decade, rather than replace it as soon as the next new shiny object comes along, aka people like us. Look, I have long been critical of Apple's self-congratulatory environmental achievements, especially considering their base memory, storage configurations, and corresponding upgrade pricing. They are making insane margins on their upgrades in order to push the average sale price and total lineup margin of their computers higher. Those that stick with the base config will likely find that their devices are destined for the landfill once their non-replaceable SSDs die sooner than they should, because it's been murdered by swap thanks to the fact that there is just a mere 8 gigs of memory, which is not enough for even a grandma in 2023. But capitalism is capitalism. Apple is liable to its shareholders. And while I'm often frustrated by their pursuit of short-term profits, I do think that their long-term efforts, like Apple 2030, are actually noble. Tim Cook's heart is in the right place, he's not the Antichrist, and reducing the emphasis on the iMac can help achieve this goal. So then what do? Well, Apple suggested to The Verge that anybody interested in a larger iMac should just consider a Mac Mini or MacBook paired with a Studio Display or ProDisplay XDR. I am sorry, but that is not an iMac replacement. For one, the 27-inch 5K iMac used to start at $1799, and it included a rather pricey, at least to Apple, Intel CPU and AMD Radeon D GPU. Today, purchasing a studio display and base model M2 Mac Mini is $2,200 for the base configuration, which, as I just complained about, has the same base memory and storage 6 years later. Even if you pretend that the cost of technology doesn't decrease over time and consider inflation, it's still more expensive to buy this combo today than it was 6 years ago. Now, this may be partly due to the fact that the studio display is outrageously designed. As we discovered in our year-and-a-half-old review of the monitor, it takes essentially the same panel from the 5K iMac, which is good, but there's no HDR, there's no high refresh rate, there's no local dimming, and it surrounds it by a bunch of unnecessary crap that pushes the cost through the roof. You've got a literal iPad SoC with 64 gigs of storage just to power a webcam that looks no better than anything else. It uses a custom-designed power supply with components laid at 90 degrees that go through cutouts in the actual PCB substrate, the only purpose of which is to make the monitor a little bit more thin. That's the same reasoning they use for the custom AC power cable. The PSU is split into 2 separate boards solely to accommodate the subwoofer chambers for nice but not mind-blowing speakers, and the cooling is completely overkill for a panel that fails to get very warm at all. And, well, you get the idea. The list goes on. It is so outrageously designed that I and many others postulated that this would share design and components with the inevitable 27-inch iMac. Or that when that project got canned, at least, this is what we got. I don't know which of those is true, if either. But I do know that it's blindingly obvious the $1,600 studio display is needlessly expensive for the panel that it houses. It was then, and it certainly remains so today. Now, the Apple Defense Squad will be quick to say, well, if it's so overpriced, then find me another 5K display with the same features that's cheaper. But this is such a silly argument because it ignores Business 101. There are no alternatives because there's no demand. Low demand means little to no competition and therefore high prices from the little selection that exists. If people wanted 5K monitors, they would exist and they would be cheap, at least cheaper than they are today. I mean, here's the price of 4K TVs over time. And it's not just because we started getting a bunch of crappy 4K TVs, although we did. It's that technology advanced, competition increased, and consumers won. 5K doesn't require some mythical technology that hasn't gotten cheaper in the 8 years since Apple created the panel with LG. No, it's just that the PC industry settled on 4K instead, and nobody really buys Apple products, at least not weird ones like this that you put on their desk. Okay, so nobody's forcing me to buy the 5K studio display, so why don't I just shut up and buy a 4K screen? Well, that's not really a suitable alternative for 2 reasons: experience and scaling. One of the great things about the iMac was that it was low barrier to entry. It just worked all the time. The studio display paired with an Apple Silicon Mac is the first time where I can ever really say that an iMac-like experience can be had in a not all-in-one. I never have to mess with the on-screen display because, well, there isn't one. There's no troubleshooting or input selection. There's no delay for the monitor to wake up. I never have to make color or brightness adjustments on device. For all its faults, it does just work. And that's why the iMac was such a compelling device. If Apple doesn't have a display that's competitively priced and people resort to getting crappy monitors from Amazon that worsen the Mac experience, the average consumer isn't just going to blame their crappy monitor, they'll blame everything, including Apple. It hurts them. More pressing, unlike Windows, macOS only does linear scaling, and sub-pixel anti-aliasing is completely gone. All displays on macOS are rendered as an integer scale of 1440p. So the studio display is rendered at 2x, 5120 by 2880, which is 218 ppi. Now, the 24-inch iMac, which is actually only 23.5, so it's even smaller than they say, I take it back, it's enormous.
Whichever model you're coming from, you'll appreciate the enormous amount of screen real estate on the new iMac display.
That display targets the same 218 pixels per inch target, and it's scaled also at 2x. The ProDisplay XDR, you guessed it, 218 ppi. You venture very far away from this number, the number that the OS targets, say when you're using a 4K display that's not a measly 21.5 inches, which yes, the old iMac was 4K and 21.5, and you'll discover that there is blurry text, scrolling shimmer, moire, and a bunch of other nasty visual artifacting if you use any scaling at all. And using a 4K or 5K display at 1x resolution, not great. Now, some people don't notice this stuff, or it doesn't really bother them. I envy those people. But even if you're not someone who needs a 1-to-1 pixel reproduction, there are still some hidden downsides, however small. Non-integer scaling requires that the display be drawn at a higher than target resolution integer scale to buffer before it's downscaled to the correct resolution. This extra step does consume more resources. Not many, but more. With Apple Silicon, they're pretty negligible. It's like less than 3%, but it is taxing your SoC more than it would be otherwise, and it consumes unified memory to do so, because it needs video memory, which is precious, especially if you have that 8GB configuration across the entire system. Now, obviously, this is not the end of the world, because even Apple has fudged pixel-perfect display scaling in the past. The M2 MacBook Air, it's not, and side by side, well, in my opinion, you can tell, but it's only about 6 pixels per inch off. The further you drift from that 218 ppi number, the worse it gets, and 4K displays at 27 inches are really off. There are precisely 4 high DPI screens that support integer scaling on macOS. You've got the Studio Display, the ProDisplay XDR, the LG Ultrafine 5K, which is just basically the old Studio Display, and the new Samsung Viewfinity S9. No demand, low supply. So Apple, because there isn't this demand, they have to be the one to improve things for their own customers if there isn't really a larger iMac on the horizon. Now hold on. I know there's people that are going to say, well, Apple didn't say no larger iMac. They just said no 27-inch iMac. So perhaps there's a 32-inch iMac on the horizon. Yeah, possible, but again, I really doubt it with this new environmental push. And even if they did, it would not be an entry-level Mac. It would be very, very expensive, because to maintain that same integer scaling, the display on a 32-inch iMac would need to be 6K, just like the ProDisplay XDR. And you would need an M3 Pro or even higher to even run the darn thing. So this would not be a replacement for the $1,799 27-inch 5K iMac. Now, I think the panel in the existing Studio Display ought to be priced in a monitor under $1,000, because if there were competition, it would be under a G easy. Now, if that means making the thing thicker, putting in slightly worse speakers, ditching the SoC, etc., so be it. But it needs to exist if the big iMac is never coming back, because that's the only thing that can perfectly replicate the iMac experience that customers literally purchased the iMac for. Now, if they did this, Studio Display 2, Electric Boogaloo, bargain bin, $1,000 thing, I think Apple could probably fill the newly created void with a middle-of-the-road HDR, locally dimmed 5K display that supported high refresh rates for around $2,500. I would buy one. Now, before the dissenters say, well, Thunderbolt 3 can't support 5K at 120 Hz, so you're just wasting your time. That's simply wrong. DisplayPort 2.1 on Thunderbolt 3 reverses a pair of the bidirectional lanes for 80 gigabits per second of unidirectional data when needed for displays. Even without compression, a 120 Hz 5K 10-bit 444 chroma sampled signal, which is more overkill than basically any monitor, including in some aspects the ProDisplay XDR, so it wouldn't actually be that. Anyway, that would be about 50 gigabits per second. Practically less. Marginally more than 8K at 30 Hz. So it's not, outside of what the standard can accommodate. DisplayPort 2 and HDMI 2.1, they could support the overhead even without compressing the signal. But Apple would almost certainly use display stream compression to compress the signal, as they've already done in the 6K ProDisplay XDR to keep it under that 40 gigabits per second threshold if possible. And that brings us to the ProDisplay XDR. We almost forgot the expensive bastard. Look, it would be great to get an update that mitigates the vignetting issue that's been around since launch. That really bugged me in the original review that I did. You should go check that out, and was the reason that I returned the display. They could fix that, but then also drastically increase the number of dimming zones. Right now, it's got 576. Not bad, but when you compare that to the MacBook Pro's 10,000 and even competing monitors 1,500 or so, boy, it doesn't seem like enough. And it sure would be great to get a mini LED panel at the $5,000 price tag Apple wants for it, especially considering that it's now encroaching 4 years old. The 27-inch iMac sunset is a sign of the times. Simplicity in design, but complexity in decision. This isn't just about streamlining a product category. It's about acknowledging that the days of the one-size-fits-all family computer, they've mostly passed. The iMac's legacy was never about screen size or power. It was always about setting a precedent for the industry. In this new era, well, that just means being smarter and greener. And the old iMac wasn't any of those things. So the legacy of the iMac isn't ending, it's just evolving. And the future looks pretty good. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, well, see ya. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay snazzy.